Australians must escape the fantasy utopia. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
Back again for another round then.
Yes. We are going to do a couple of interesting things in this show today. But people may be looking at me going, well, why is John Adams dressed up in a suit? Now, I had the fortune of giving a speech about the silver market in Sydney this afternoon, and I've just travelled back from Sydney to come here to your studio. A couple of observations I'll make about my experience in Sydney this afternoon, and we're recording on Sunday evening, is that one person said that if you and I were doing this show in Colombia, and he is of Colombian descent, we would be dead. So basically, he said that the type of discussions we're having, which are fundamental and critical, they are not welcomed in other parts of the world. And I thought that was quite fascinating, because what we're trying to do with these shows is to bring some objectivity and some truth to a whole host of economic events. And on occasion, we do call out public officials. Now, in some countries, and when you think about some countries, Colombia is not top of mind to my mind. But it's interesting that some person said that that our content would be basically persona non grata in Colombia. So that was the interesting point. And because of that sort of issue. Now, this is my third seminar that I've done in the last 2 months. So I've done Adelaide, I did Newcastle, today I did a small one in Sydney. I continue to hear people say, I'm afraid to speak. And good on you and Martin for speaking. Well, again, I don't think people, particularly in this country, need to be as alarmed as other countries about speaking, particularly about macroeconomics. I mean, it's not like we're talking about, to my mind, macroeconomics is not that sensitive, but maybe to others, potentially it could be. But because people are scared, because people are not willing to speak, the issue as a result of that is we have a big chunk of the population that is ignorant about a whole host of economic issues, and they are being led to believe fantasy propositions. Now, we addressed one fantasy proposition in the last show, and then this show we're going to address another one, and that's about the age pension.
Yes. And let me just make a point. That is, I'm very used to philosophical debate and discussion, right? And going into issues and exploring those issues. I mean, that's my training, that's my background. And in academic circles, that's normally what you do, right? What I find is that those people who've not had that experience are really nervous about asking some of the bigger questions, right? They almost don't want to look over the parapet for feel what might be over the parapet. Whereas I would say you've got to understand what's over there, what is beyond the parapet, because without that you can't make good decisions. So for me, what we do here is really, really important. I want to encourage more people to discuss, debate, and ask questions, because to my mind, asking questions is part of being human.
Absolutely. And just to sort of make one additional point is, in my experience, having been recording with you for a few years, I've heard these sort of comments from both domestic-born Australians as well as immigrants. So it is a interesting phenomena that people have said, well, you have a platform, and so, well, nothing prevents you from having your own platform yes. and actually exposing whatever sort of truth that you wish to have a chat about. But today we're going to talk about the age pension because, Martin, so in the last week I had a specific conversation, and a comment was made to me, and I thought to myself, well, one, that's false, and two, I've heard this comment being said on multiple occasions, and it's time to call out some truth about this. Now, I was in a situation where I spoke with a couple of people here in the Illawarra, and one of these people is close to retirement age, and the comment was made to me that this person is nearing, because he started work in his teens, so he's nearing on 50 years of work throughout his life, and the comment he made was, by virtue of having worked nearly half a century, I'm entitled to the pension because of my service as a worker. Now, I immediately said, no, you're not. You're not entitled to anything just because you worked. And so this, and I should say, particularly, I remember maybe it was after the first ABBA budget in 2014 that ABBA and Hockey dropped, and there was maybe a show on the ABC Q&A or something like that. And I remember someone said exactly the same thing. I've worked all my life. I'm now entitled to the pension. I'm sure some of our audience members believe that. That is just a myth. It's a fantasy. You are actually entitled to nothing just because you worked for 50 years or 40 years or whatever the case may be. And we're going to explore this issue and actually spell out what we think are the facts that are related to the age pension.
Yeah, I think it's worth exploring this because you're right, it's an area that is very badly understood. And of course, there are a lot of people who try and reconstruct their finances as they move into retirement to keep their assets at a certain level to make sure they can access this pension, right? Thinking it's a right, is almost divine right?
Yes.
But actually, there's a bunch of issues that people need to understand.
Absolutely. So before we actually call out what is the reality of the age pension, so I want to sort of give a bit of context. Because remember, the premise that was put to me was, by virtue of me working 50 years, I have this natural inherent right to the pension. Well, a lot of people don't actually understand where the pension came from and how the pension was initially devised, particularly in this country. So the interesting thing is that the history of the age pension in the Western world, well, the first country that actually introduced it on a nationwide basis was actually Germany in 1889. Now, the Chancellor at the time, Otto von Bismarck, introduced the age pension, and that was after he brought in other forms of insurance, like healthcare, like unemployment insurance, etc. What I'm just going to do now is just quote from a paper that I found about what Bismarck did. And here's the quote, "The disability and old age pension system was designed to pay a disability pension if the insured were unable to work before they reached the age of 70, and to pay an old age pension for workers unable to work because of old age." Now, Martin, the interesting thing here is that the first element is the pension cut in at 70 years old in 1889, when life expectancy was probably in the early 50s.
Yep.
So this was designed for those who were pretty much frail and had no capacity, no physical or mental capacity to work. They thought, well, let's actually allow these people to have some dignity in their frailness before they go and face their maker. So again, the first pension system was never a right about your service to your workforce or that you've worked for 30, 40, 50 years. It was, you are so frail that you cannot work, you cannot generate income, and we're going to provide you some form of assistance. So that's probably, I think, important to know. So again, if Australians have said, I've worked all my life, I'm entitled to the pension, the first pension system in the world did not come up with that form of design. So that's point number one. Now, point number two about Bismarck is, in Germany during the late 19th century, the socialists, the Marxists, the communists, they were on the ascendancy. So obviously this is pre-Russian Revolution. Lenin was actually roaming around in terms of Europe. So there was a lot of active Marxists, communists, socialists who were actually fomenting a new political movement in Europe. And some of this political movement was anti-establishment, anti-monarchy, anti-military, and Bismarck in particular was concerned about socialism in Germany, and and there was a point in time during his reign he actually banned the Socialist Party and the Communist Party from being registered an official political party in Germany. So part of the philosophy, or the why did he do this in 1889, it was to give some concessions to workers so that they were not going to be influenced to go and join a communist party or a socialist party. So there was a lot of politics around the introduction of the pension, and again, had nothing to do with people working 40, 50 years before they're entitled to a particular government payment.
I reckon, John, most people will be really surprised to hear that, right? Because there's now an assumed connection between longevity of work and right to access it. Right?
Indeed.
Interesting to see where that came into play, because it's not where it started.
Indeed. Now the interesting thing when we switch to Australia, Martin, is the interesting thing. Now our pension in Australia, the nationwide pension, was introduced in 1908, and the UK was actually 1 year after. So we actually beat the UK. So we have no influence. So we have not been influenced by Britain about the need to have a pension in Australia. So where did the pension idea come from in the Australian context? Now, so I'm going to read a quote from the Australian National Museum, because I actually found this fascinating. So here's the quote. Following the economic depression of the early 1890s, when poverty became widespread, who should support those unable to look after themselves became a hot issue. Now, it's interesting. We've talked a lot about the 1892 depression. I remember some people after our show said, well, I had no idea that there was a depression in 1892. And yet, and again, so just so our audience understands, in the 1880s, we had a massive land bubble, very much similar like that we have today. And in 1892, that bubble collapsed and it took down the banks. And it basically led to, over 2 years, a fall of GDP of 17%, which was catastrophic, and took the rest of the decade to actually have some sort of recovery. So a lot of people suffered in the 1890s in Australia, and that level of massive destitution, that led to a new political topic about how do we support those who can't support themselves. And again, the origins of the pension in this country had nothing to do with work. It had everything to do with a economic crisis, and how do we support those that are unable or too old to make ends meet.
And it's just worth underscoring, John, what we're talking about here when we say pension is the government scheme, right? People might have saved in some other ways and might have the equivalent of a pension. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the government scheme.
Yes, we're talking about the government-funded scheme.
Yep.
We're not talking about superannuation. We're not talking about any sort of fixed income product that you get at retirement age. Just the government pension, because that's the context in which I had this conversation. Now, the other interesting thing I picked up from the Australian National Museum website is that the first pension in Australia was actually in New South Wales, and this was started in 1900, before the pension the national pension in 1908. And the surprising thing, and to be honest, I didn't understand. Had no idea that this was true. Was there was a racial component to the New South Wales pension system. I'm just going to quote this from the Australian National Museum website. Quote, New South Wales introduced legislation in 1900. Every person in the community, unless Aboriginal, alien or Asiatic, who was above the age of 60, who had resided in New South Wales for 15 years and whose income did not exceed £50 a year, would be entitled to a pension of 10 shillings a week when single. Married couples received 15 shillings a week, which was more or less adequate. Again, nothing to do with work, nothing to do with work service. And dare I say, Martin, that there would have been foreigners, there would have been Asians living in Australia who would have paid taxes. And even though they paid taxes and actually followed the laws of the land, in 1900, they were not entitled to a government pension. And that again brings a new element to this conversation about what are Australians really entitled for. Now, the other surprising thing, and to be honest, I actually think this next element is actually not a bad idea, because there was a community expectation or a community obligation on individuals that they actually had to be of good character in order to get the pension. And the good character in 1900 in New South Wales meant something very specific. So let's actually bring this quote up. Quote, the pensioner also had to be of good character, which generally remained undefined, although those who had deserted their spouse and children in the previous 5 years were not eligible. So basically, if you were married here in New South Wales, and you walked out on your wife, or if you were the woman, if you walked out on your husband and you abandoned your kids, no pension. So basically, they say that there is an expectation that you as a parent, you as a husband or wife, have an obligation to keep the family unit together. And if you don't meet that social contract, then the government's not going to give you a cent. Again, nothing to do with work. Now, I do think that there is something to be said around mutual obligation, because I do think that if there are some strings attached to government payments, people will tend to comply with those whatever those rules are. And I do think that, particularly when it comes to children, that parents spending time with their kids is a very good thing. So not to say that I'm advocating for that to be reintroduced here in Australia, but the fact that that was in play 120 years ago, the potentially something could be said that about fixing some of our current social ills using government payments and putting rules attached.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think, again, people will be surprised to see that those tests were in place. Just shows you that, certain people were able to get it, certain people weren't able to get it. The people in charge decided who could and who couldn't.
Precisely, and I'm glad you said it the way you said it, man, because that's, I guess, one of the key messages of the show is that the powers that be will decide who gets it and who does not get it, and that decision, that determination, can change. That is not fixed in stone. It's not like we have a natural right to breathe the air. It's not as fixed in stone as that. Now, so we've talked about New South Wales. Now, like we said, the national scheme was introduced in 1908. During the 1890s, when we had the constitutional debates about becoming a country, as in Australia, there was a determination among the founders of Australia in the 1890s to give the power for the national pension to the federal government. So that's why in the Constitution, in Section 51, paragraph 23, the federal parliament has the power to come up with a pension. So when the Federation was created in 1901, in 1905, 1906, Deakin, as Prime Minister, called for a Royal Commission to examine a nationwide pension scheme, and that led to the Parliament passing legislation in 1908, where the pension was first introduced. Now, we're talking about some of the rules around the New South Wales pension. Funny thing is, some of those same rules carried on in the national scheme. So again, I'm taking some information from the website of the Federal Parliament, and I'm just going to go through to the next slide. So, quote, groups excluded from eligibility were those living overseas, aliens, those naturalised for less than 3 years, overseas-born Asiatics, i.e. Asians, and Aboriginal natives of Australia, Africa, the Pacific Islands, or New Zealand. Again, race-based aged care, nothing to do with work, nothing to do with your service. If you're white, you were able to get the pension. So there was a racial qualification to the pension. Now, there were some additional requirements on the pension, and I want to go through that as well. So here, bring up the next, in terms of the next slide, applicants for the age pension were required to be residing in Australia when claiming a pension, to have continuously resided in Australia for at least 20 years, to be of good character, to have not deserted or failed to maintain their wife, if a husband, or deserted their husband, if a wife, in the preceding 5 years without just cause, to have not deserted if a mother, or failed to maintain if a father, any children under the age of 14 in the preceding 5 years. Again, nothing to do with work. It was all about your capacity to look after yourself in old age, and you were not naturally inherent. It wasn't an inherent right. You actually had to demonstrate good character, looking after your family, and if you couldn't look after your family, the government would say you're on your own.
Yeah, pretty stark, isn't it?
Yes.
All right, John, so we've laid the foundations, right? But my guessing is that things have evolved a bit since then, surely.
Yes, yes. So one of the interesting things that I found was that as time has passed from 1908, the pension has evolved and different things have happened in terms of the pension. So a couple of interesting points. In 1926, Indians born in British India were eligible for the pension. So previously, before 1926, they were not. Then they were. In 1941, Asians who were British subjects were eligible for the pension. In 1942, if you were indigenous and you were living in an urban environment, so you were not living in a nomadic area that was under state government control, you were eligible for the pension. In 1966, aliens and Aboriginals and those Aboriginals living in nomadic lifestyle were eligible for the pension. Now, here's an interesting thing that I found fascinating. Before 1942, the pension was taxable. So whatever money you got, you could be taxed on it as part of your overall tax bill, and that ended in 1942 under the Curtin government. Now, 1974 under Whitlam, they brought in rules to say that if you were an Australian and you were living outside of Australia, you still had to comply with certain rules, but you could still get the pension. Now, I know that in the last decade that became an issue because I think we pay north of $600 million a year to pensioners who live outside the country. And I think there was an attempt by the Abbott government to tighten some of those rules, and there was immediate pushback about that. But again, before 1974, if you had worked all your life in Australia, and then in retirement you want to live overseas, you were on your own. You were not the Australian taxpayers today. In Australia, we're not going to pay people to live overseas. What I want to get our audience to understand crystal clear, so there's no ambiguity about this myth of because I worked for 50 years, I'm entitled to the pension. So the reality is that there is no inherent right to the pension in this country. The ability to get the pension is a function of the laws of the parliament and the financial capacity of the parliament and the government to pay.
Yep.
If you get a point in time where the government does not have the capacity to pay, guess what? You may see your pension cut. You may not have any sort of pension. And that's why the conversation we had in our last show and not only the last show but the last three shows about the federal budget as well as the state government budgets, it is so critical because if you are planning your retirement on the expectation that in the next 20 or 25 years of the rest of your life you're going to get the pension, if we don't rein these politicians in with these imprudent financial decisions around government spending, there could be a point in time where you may see your financial conditions change radically. And one of the interesting things that I was surprised about was that in 1931, during the Great Depression, the government, and this was the Scullin government before Joseph Lyons was elected, the Scullin government cut the pension in Australia. So let's actually bring this up. So this is from the Parliament's own website. So 1931, from July, pension rates were reduced as part of the emergency financial measures taken during the Depression. So again, a lot of times people will say to me, the government will never do that. Never will happen here. She'll be right. Well, we have, just like we showed in 2019 on bail-in, that bail-in happened in Australia in 1892. If anyone says they will never cut the pension, they will never take the pension away from me because I worked for 50 years and I gave my life to this country, guess what? During financial extreme conditions, they have in historical times, in the Depression, they cut the pension. So people should not be under any illusion. And the other point I'll make, Martin, is that when this individual said this to me, I said, well, who told you have this right to the pension? And the answer was, well, when I was growing up, and again, this is an Australian in his 60s, and he was born here. He said, as I was growing up, this is what the politicians told me, that if you committed your life to a life of work in this country, you will have an inherent right to the pension. Now, when this person said this to me, I said, well, Parliament's full of lying criminals, and I should know because I used to work in the building. So just because some politician 30 years ago said that if you worked all your life you're going to get the pension, that means nothing. The other point I made to this individual was, and this is critical, is I said, whatever tax you've paid over 50 years of work, that money is gone. It has been spent.
Yep.
It goes to consolidated revenue, and then it is spent on an annual basis. So I said, whatever you've paid in tax, whether that money was spent prudently or imprudently, it's gone. So if you are now planning your retirement on the expectation of getting a part pension or a full pension, you are relying on the generosity of current taxpayers and the financial balance sheet of the government. And if that ever comes into question, your financial future is in peril. And this person was quite shocked when I said this, but I said, that is the reality of the situation. And you've got to get out of this utopia of, because I work 50 years, I get the pension. No, you do not. You get the pension up until the point where we can no longer borrow. And again, we have, by June 2025, gross federal government debt is at $1.2 trillion. We have the state governments drowning in debt. We have foreign debt at $2.5 trillion. We have the biggest household debt in the history of the country. And pensioners, current pensioners, or those who are getting close to retirement, need to wake up and say, well, if government finances, if this economy is not managed well in the next 5 to 10 years, if we're not getting on top of these issues, what's going to happen to me in retirement? Because that is a frightening thing when you are too old to actually start to generate sufficient income to supplement any cuts or any changes in terms of the government pension.
I agree, John. It is a frightening thought. And I just want to underscore one of the things you said a little while ago, because I reckon most people will have assumed somehow when they were paying their taxes through their working life, that some of those taxes were going to some sort of accumulation fund, right, that would actually translate to their pension when they got to the end of their working life, right? That's what I guess most people would assume. That is completely wrong, right?
I mean, that happens in the superannuation system. So we work and make a contribution to super, yes. But the government pension is exactly right. No money has been put aside for the age pension.
Correct. So it is always funded out of current revenue, right, and current effectively costs. So what that means is that what's happened in the past is in the past, right? Every year the government has to budget to pay a certain amount for the pension, right? And as you say, if their finances get really, really strapped, it'll be on the agenda potentially to say, well, what can we afford now?
Exactly. The other point is that, I mean, just to sort of borrow Harry Dent's book for a second, Harry Dent has looked a lot about demographics.
Yep.
Well, when the pension was designed, the majority of Australians were very young because we had a lot of immigrants coming from the UK. So when there was this and again, the other thing is when the pension, it was introduced in 1908, the average life expectancy in Australia was 55. So again, it wasn't about service to your country or service to the workforce. It was most people by the age of 65 in this country were old and frail, and obviously with better nutrition, better education, and better living standards, Australians can live longer and work longer than a century ago. So again, now we haven't really we've only made a minor adjustment to the eligibility age around the pension. But again, the pension was designed for a time where there was a small number of pensioners, and they were very frail. We now have a situation where there's a lot of people at 65 and 70 years old who can still have the capacity to work, but they're eligible for the pension. And yet there's a lot of them now because of the aging of the population. So the financial the financial position of the government vis-a-vis the pension has changed because the demographics of the country has changed. But at the same time, when we're drowning in debt, there could be some hard decisions to be made. And I just want to bring up this article I found from the Financial Times, which was from 2013. So this is by the OECD, saying that countries in Europe as well as in Japan, which is in the OECD, were facing problems around decisions around the pension. So I just want to bring this quote up. Quote, "Member states are struggling to balance sustainability, offering pensions that taxpayers can afford, against the risk of significant numbers of elderly falling into poverty." This was post-GFC 2013, and a lot of European countries are going, well, we don't want old people to be super poor and in destitution, but how do we afford this at the same time? And we haven't reached that situation yet where we have to make that choice between destitution of old people and basically how do we afford this. But given the current fiscal position that Morrison and Frydenberg has put us in post-COVID-19, that question will come up at some point in the future. And Australians who live in this fantasy utopia, who believe they have some sort of inherent right, again, you need to wake up. And the other thing I would say is, so if people don't want to be in a situation where they're in their 70s or 80s and thinking, well, the government just cut the pension, how do I live? If you want to avoid that situation, now is the time that it's not just Martin North and John Adams. Every Australian needs to basically call on politicians to act responsibly with government finances, so that we don't have these harsh, very cruel decisions to make down the track.
And John, I'll say that there's also some sneaky stuff that could go on, right? So, for example, in the UK, they've defined differently now the rate of inflation that they use to adjust the pensions. It's actually going to be lower than it was, right? So whereas previously the growth in the pension was actually pretty strong, right, relative to the cost of living, it's now suddenly getting weaker, right? So as well as turning the taps off completely, you could well expect to see minor adjustments that sort of just turns down the value of the pension as well. So this isn't a 0-100% thing. There's stuff in the middle, right? And I'll tell you what, I wouldn't be surprised to see some of that quite soon.
Yes. I mean, so there's all sorts of ways the government can sort of change this, whether it's saying if you live overseas, you're no longer going to get an Australian pension. It could be that they change the rate of increase. They could say, well, we're going to cut the rate of the pension, or we're going to exclude certain groups. So there's all sorts of ways that they can divvy this up. But all of those decisions will be made when the horror of these really bad decisions come to the fore. And just before we conclude the show, just wanted to touch on the Future Fund, because some people think, well, we have this bucket of money in the Future Fund. Well, what is that money for? Now, it's interesting that the Future Fund on the Future Fund website is now saying it's Australia's sovereign fund. Now, this fund is to fund the government's unfunded liabilities. Now, in theory, you could say that the pension is an unfunded liability because they've made a promise to people they've made a promise that if once you get into retirement, you're going to get the pension. But there are some contractual unfunded liabilities that the government has entered into that they are legally on the hook for, and that is the military. So the military pensions, as well as the superannuation of the public service. So now the as of March of this year, the Future Fund held $178.6 billion, and that is to fund these superannuation obligations for the military and the public service going forward for the next 20 to 25 years. So, again, if people think that we can take some of this Future Fund money and cover the pension for old people, that is not the way the legislation has been designed. And even if government wanted to do that, you can only maybe pay the pension for a couple of years, and then the money's going to run out anyway.
And just on that, just think about this, right? Because those public servants who've got these much more superior pension arrangements, right? Significantly higher, right? Means that they are actually protected by the Future Fund. right?
Yes.
Normal Australians are not.
That's
It's
right.
a fundamentally unfair structure that was put in place to provide protection for a small proportion of public servants in Australia.
Yes, yes. Although, on the other hand, when the future fund was designed, Peter Costello, as the treasurer, realised that they made all these promises to pay super, and they don't have the money. So they said, well, we need to have the money in one form or another. So there was a basis for some long-term financial planning.
I'm not saying that, but people should, as you said, people should understand the future fund is not going to be a get-out-of-jail card for every pensioner.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So Martin, as we come to the close, as we go forward in our discussions, there are a multitude of myths and fantasies that Australians believe in. The she'll be right attitude. They'll never do that to me. I have a natural right to the pension because I've worked for 50 years. It's not my debt. It's someone else's debt, not my problem. What I think we need to do, you and I, with this show, is to continue to bring the facts forward and to say to Australians, you cannot believe in things that have no basis in fact, because if you base your financial future off these myths, at some point, given all the tumultuous financial conditions that we now face going forward, at some point these myths are going to result in real life catastrophic impacts on your life, and I don't want that on anyone.
John, I think that's absolutely right. And, we've spoken today about effectively the government pension, right? There's a whole other conversation which we won't have today about the superannuation system and the way that isn't working very well either, right? So I would say to you that people should be concerned not only about, the superannuation sector, but the government pension as well. These financial questions are really critical for people to get their heads around, right? You can't just assume it's all going to work out fine, right? It may not. And so you should be planning accordingly.
Yes. You should be planning accordingly, but more importantly, if you don't want to be in a catastrophic position in the future, you have the ability to stop the government doing you have the ability to stop the government in terms of what they're doing now. Just as a final note, during the week I had a member of parliament call me up, wanted to pick my brain about the economy and where things are going. And I was extremely rude to this politician because I've had it. And I just said, what the hell did you do to my kids? He goes, what do you mean? You just bankrupted them because you tried to bail out the banks. And again, he knew exactly why the stimulus was injected last year. He basically admitted on the phone that Australian banks have lent out twice as much lending on a proportional basis to mortgages relative to the international standard. If the housing market went, the banks would go. The whole basis of the stimulus was to keep the banks solvent by ensuring that people could maintain their cash flow levels. And I said, well, what about all this debt, all this government debt? And all I got back was, well, there's a number of people on the backbench concerned. So what does that mean? We're having, a number of us are having a discussion. So again, what does that mean? And the reality is, Martin, to be completely frank, I've been around politics in this country for 20 years. All they do is talk. It's all, like Trump said in 2016, all talk, no action. And I just basically had it with this politician, and the conversation came to an abrupt end. But again, the thing is, people need to wake up and say to themselves, well, they have a role to play to influence Parliament so we don't go down this catastrophic path.
Yeah, and that's right, isn't it, John? Because ultimately, the democratic process needs to actually be from the voice of the people, right?
Yes.
And the people need to actually start raising their concerns and issues about this, right? Don't just assume that everything is wonderful and it's all going to work itself. I don't believe the bullshit, if I can use that phrase, right? We are in a serious situation here, and it's going to get significantly worse unless they change tack and direction, right? They won't do that unless democracy speaks, unless people speak, unless we actually start getting momentum that they understand we're not up for it anymore.
Indeed. And for those who say, what can I do? We showed with the cash ban that if enough people come together, we can change the will of Parliament.
So another opportunity, John.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that. Martin North, John Adams. In the interest of the people, we'll see you next time.